Cain killed his own brother. God exiled him for it. And right after that, in the very same chapter, Scripture says Cain went out and knew his wife, and she bore him a son. Wait, his wife? The Bible has only named 4 people alive on earth at this point: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. So where exactly did Cain's wife come from? Stay with me, because the answer is sitting closer to the text than almost anyone realizes. In the beginning, there were only 2 people, Adam and Eve, placed in a garden overflowing with life. God's command to them was simple and total: be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Not populate a village, fill the entire earth. From the very first chapter of Genesis, the plan was never for humanity to stay small. It was always meant to grow into a vast, sprawling family tree, starting from a single root. But the garden didn't last. After the fall, Adam and Eve were sent out into a harsher world east of Eden, a world where they would now have children the ordinary way, generation after generation. This is the part most people skip past quickly. But it matters because everything that follows, including the mystery of Cain's wife, depends on understanding just how much time and how many descendants came from this one starting point. Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain, who worked the soil as a farmer, and Abel, who tended sheep as a shepherd. Genesis is clear that these 2 were not the only children Adam and Eve would ever have. They're simply the first 2 the story focuses on, because of what happens between them next. Keep that detail in mind. It becomes the key to everything later in this video. Cain's offering was rejected, Abel's was accepted, and in the anger that followed, Cain led his brother out to a field and killed him. When God confronted him, Cain tried to hide behind a question of his own. Am I my brother's keeper? God already knew the answer. Abel's blood, the text says, was crying out from the ground. This single act sends Cain away from his family for the rest of the story. God's judgment on Cain was exile, not execution. He would be a restless wanderer, cut off from the ground he once farmed. And Cain said something strange right here. He feared that whoever found him would kill him. Whoever, not his parents, not his brother, now dead. Whoever. That single word is the first clue that Cain's world was already bigger than the 4 names Genesis has mentioned so far. Cain settled east of Eden in a place called the Land of Nod, and it's here, right after his exile, that Genesis casually mentions he took a wife. No introduction, no explanation, just a simple statement, as if the original readers wouldn't have blinked at it at all. That's actually the biggest hint in the whole passage. The ancient audience hearing this for the first time likely found the answer obvious. Here's the verse that unlocks everything. Genesis chapter 5 says, Adam lived 930 years and had other sons and daughters. Genesis doesn't name most of them, but it plainly states they existed, many of them over centuries. Ancient genealogies routinely skipped names that weren't relevant to the main storyline. Cain's wife didn't need to be introduced by name, because she was simply one of his own sisters, born sometime after Cain and Abel. With lifespans stretching close to 1,000 years, Adam and Eve had time to have dozens, even hundreds of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren before Cain ever left for Nod. By the time Cain settled there and built a city, as Genesis records, there was already a growing population of his own extended family to draw from. The mystery isn't that there was no one else, it's that Genesis simply didn't stop to list them all. So yes, this means Cain almost certainly married a sister, or possibly a niece. To modern ears, that sounds shocking, but no law against it existed yet. The prohibition against close family marriage wasn't given until the time of Moses, in the book of Leviticus, thousands of years later. At the very start of the human race, when only one family existed on earth, this wasn't a moral failure, It was the only option available. There's also a scientific piece to this. Many young Earth creation scholars point out that the human genome, fresh from creation, hadn't yet accumulated the genetic mutations that make close family reproduction risky today. In other words, the biological concern that makes this practice dangerous now simply didn't apply at the dawn of the human race. What became forbidden later wasn't arbitrary. It became necessary only once those genetic risks had built up over generations. The most common objection is simple. Doesn't the Bible call this sin? Not at this point in the story. Sin is failing to follow God's revealed commands, and no command against sibling marriage existed yet. God gave that law to Moses centuries later for a specific reason tied to a growing, diversifying population. Applying a future law backward onto the very first family isn't sound reading. It's judging ancient history by rules that didn't yet exist. It's worth noting this question isn't new. Ancient Jewish traditions, including the Book of Jubilees, name Cain's wife directly, calling her Awan and identifying her plainly as his sister. That text isn't part of Scripture, so it carries no binding authority, but it shows something important. The earliest readers of Genesis weren't confused by this detail at all. They simply assumed the obvious explanation the text was pointing toward. Some skeptics take this further, arguing Cain's fear of being killed proves other humans already existed outside Adam and Eve's line entirely, so-called people outside Eden. But Genesis is explicit that Adam is called the father of all the living. The text never introduces a separate population. Cain's fear makes far more sense as looking forward toward the descendants and extended family that would grow around him in the years after his exile. Genesis actually confirms this population growth directly. It tells us Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. You cannot build a city with two people. A city requires families, laborers, and generations already living together. This detail alone confirms that by the time Cain settled in Nod, a real and growing human community existed around him. So the mystery of Cain's wife isn't a hole in Scripture at all. It's a reminder that Genesis was never written as an exhaustive census. It names who matters to the story being told and trusts the reader to understand the rest. Vast stretches of ordinary family life happening quietly in the background. Far from undermining the Bible's reliability, this is exactly what we'd expect from an ancient historical narrative. This question teaches us something bigger than genealogy. It's easy to assume silence in Scripture means contradiction, but silence often just means the text is focused on what matters most: sin, judgment, mercy, and God's ongoing plan for humanity, not a full family tree. When we let Genesis answer the questions it was actually trying to answer, mysteries like this one quietly resolve themselves. Cain's wife was never meant to be a scandal. She was simply part of a large, unnamed family that Genesis assumed its earliest readers already understood. The real story here isn't where she came from. It's how quickly humanity multiplied, exactly as God commanded in the very first chapter of the Bible. What looks like a gap in the text is actually proof the plan was already working. So the next time someone raises this question to challenge your faith, you'll know exactly how to answer it. But I want to hear from you. What other Bible question has stopped you in your tracks like this one did? Put it in the comments below, and it might just become the next video on this channel. If this helped you see Scripture a little differently today, subscribe, because we're just getting started.